Halifax Harbour, December 6th, 1917. A Thursday morning, clear and cold. The water in the Narrows is flat, the sky is pale. From the dockside, you can see the whole basin at once. The Dartmouth shore on one side, the Richmond district of Halifax on the other, and between them a channel narrow enough that ships crossing it in opposite directions have to negotiate their path the way two people navigate a doorway, each watching the other, each making small adjustments, each relying on a shared understanding of who moves which way. A French munitions freighter called the Mont-Blanc is moving through the Narrows toward Bedford Basin. She is carrying 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of benzol in drums lashed to her forward deck, and 10 tons of gun cotton. The drums are painted gray. There is nothing painted on her hull to tell you what she holds. The cargo manifest exists. The French Navy signed it. The British Naval Command in Halifax has a copy. But in the Narrows on the morning of December 6th, none of that information is visible from the deck of the ship coming the other way. The ship coming the other way is the Immo, a Norwegian vessel chartered for Belgian relief, running behind schedule and moving too fast for the channel. A chain of earlier maneuvers had put her out of her lane. An American steamer's pilot was on the wrong side, and the Immo deviated to avoid her, then deviated further to avoid a tug with barges in tow, and by the time she sighted the Mont-Blanc, she was well over on the Dartmouth side of the channel, the Mont-Blanc side with little room to correct. They exchanged whistle signals. The Mont-Blanc signals once, indicating the expected port-to-port passing. The Immo signals twice, indicating the opposite. In the space between those signals, the shared understanding of the channel breaks down. Both ships maneuver. The maneuvering makes things worse. At around 8:45 in the morning, the Immo's bow strikes the Mont-Blanc on her forward starboard side. The collision is slow. The ships separate, but the impact has ruptured the benzol drums on the Mont-Blanc's forward deck, and the benzol is running across the planking, and as the ships pulled apart, sparks found the vapor. The Mont-Blanc is on fire. From that moment, Halifax had less than 20 minutes. The warning existed. The question was whether it could move. The men aboard the Mont-Blanc knew exactly what they were sitting on. Before leaving New York, the crew had been briefed on the cargo. The captain, Aimé Le Medec, knew. The pilot, Francis Mackey, who had boarded at the harbor entrance and was guiding the ship through the Narrows, knew. They had spent the entire transit trying to protect a hold full of explosives from any shock that might detonate it. The pilot's one firm instruction was not to run aground. A grounding might set off the cargo before they could do anything. When the fire started, the crew's calculation was immediate. There was nothing aboard that ship capable of fighting a benzol fire. The fire was already spreading across the forward deck. Le Medec ordered the crew into the lifeboats, and they rowed hard for the Dartmouth shore. They shouted warnings as they went, but they shouted in French, and the men on the Halifax dock spoke English. And even if the language had been shared, the noise of a wartime harbor, the engines, the machinery, the full industry of a port running at capacity, swallowed most of it. On the Halifax side, people were watching a ship burn. The black smoke was visible across the city. A fire drifting toward Pier 6 drew people to windows and docks the way serious events always draw people, because looking at danger is the first step in deciding whether the danger is yours. Nobody on the Halifax waterfront had been told that the burning ship was carrying a cargo capable of turning a harbor accident into a city-level disaster. There was no signal flag that said so. There was no protocol that required one. The fire burned for just under 20 minutes. The Richmond district climbed the hill above the Narrows in rows of wooden houses, churches, foundries, and schools. Richmond was where the dock workers lived, where the rail yard families came home at night, where children walked to school in the morning, along streets that looked down directly to the water. By 8:45, most of those children were already at their desks. Richmond School stood on Room Street, less than 500 meters from Pier 6. What the Nova Scotia Archives records is this: 88 of its students were killed in the explosion. 2 died inside the school itself. The other 86 were killed outside, at home, in the streets, on their way in. Some accounts record that children from the school had gone down toward the harbor to watch the burning ship, drawn by the same instinct that drew everyone else that morning. Nobody stopped them. Nobody knew to stop them. What the teachers at Richmond School did not have, and could not have had, because no channel existed to deliver it, was the information that the burning ship across the water held 2,300 tons of picric acid and 200 tons of TNT. The system that managed harbor traffic had never been designed to speak to the system that managed schools. Those two systems had no connection. They had never needed one before. A kilometer away on Gottingen Street stood the Halifax School for the Deaf, a boarding school with about 90 students from across the region. It was far enough from the blast center that the building survived, but not so far that the explosion passed it by. When the Mont-Blanc detonated, the shock wave tore through the building. Windows shattered. The principal took immediate charge. He moved everyone to the basement. Because it was a boarding school with its own infirmary, supplies, and nursing staff, the community could shelter in place. All 90 students survived. The difference in outcome between Richmond School and the School for the Deaf was partly distance, but it was also something else. The School for the Deaf had a building that could absorb the blast, a principal who could act quickly, and the internal infrastructure to respond. Richmond School had none of those advantages and had no warning that would have allowed it to create them. The 88 dead had done nothing wrong. They had walked the same streets their families had always walked, toward the same school they had always attended, on a morning that looked like every other morning. Behind that number were children doing the most ordinary thing in the world, going to school on a Thursday. While the Mont-Blanc burned and drifted, the people who could see her did what the situation appeared to call for. The Stella Maris was a small Royal Canadian Navy patrol tug assigned to harbor work. Her captain, Horatio Brannan, brought her alongside the burning Mont-Blanc and attempted to get a line on her, to tow her away from the pier before the fire spread to the docks. Brannan was doing exactly the job he had been given. His crew moved the Stella Maris in close enough to work a tow line. They did not know what she was carrying. The crew of a boat from HMS Highflyer, a British cruiser in the harbor, also came across. They had the same information as Brannan. A ship was on fire, and the thing to do with a ship on fire is to approach it. Some accounts record that the Highflyer's crew boarded the Mont-Blanc's deck. One man from that boat survived. At 9:04:35, the Mont-Blanc exploded. The anchor, a piece of iron weighing 517 kilograms, landed 3 kilometers to the north of the Narrows. One of the ship's deck guns came down on the far side of the Halifax Peninsula. Until 1945, the Halifax explosion was the largest human-made explosion on record, the kind of blast against which later explosions would be measured. The pressure wave leveled every structure within 800 meters, snapped iron rails, and shattered windows 80 kilometers away. In the harbor, the Emma was driven ashore by the wave that followed. Brannan and the crew of the Highflyer's boat had moved toward a danger that the system had not told them was there. The information that could have turned them around was in the cargo manifest. It was in the knowledge of the Mont-Blanc's crew, who were watching from the Dartmouth shore as the rescue boats came alongside. The channel between that knowledge and those men had never been built. There is one man in this story who had both the information and a way to act on it. Vince Coleman was a dispatcher for the Canadian Government Railways, working at the telegraph office in the Richmond rail yards, a few hundred feet from Pier 6. His job was to control rail traffic generated by the crowded wartime harbor. On the morning of December 6th, he and a colleague named William Lovett were at their stations when the Mont-Blanc caught fire. Accounts differ on whether it was a passing sailor or a colleague who had spoken to someone from the waterfront, came to the station and told Coleman what the burning ship was carrying. Coleman understood immediately what this meant for the rail line. The number 10, an overnight passenger train from St. John carrying nearly 300 people, was inbound and due in Halifax at around 8:55. The main line ran along the western shore of Bedford Basin and directly into the Richmond yards, directly through the path of what was coming. Lovett left the office. Coleman went back to the telegraph key. The message he sent has been preserved in slightly different wordings across different records. The most widely cited version reads, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." Whether Coleman's message directly stopped number 10 is still uncertain. One account places the train already past Rockingham and close enough to suffer broken windows. Another, from conductor Gillespie, says the train was held at Rockingham for 15 minutes. The evidence never fully closes, but the larger fact does. Coleman's message moved through the rail network before Halifax went silent. What the record does not dispute is this: Coleman's message traveled the intercolonial railway network as far as Truro, reaching every station along the line. When the explosion came and Halifax went silent, the railway network already had the information. The first relief trains left Truro within hours. The injured were evacuated. Supplies came back in. The rail link was the artery through which aid reached a devastated city, and Coleman had kept it open in the minutes before the blast made it necessary. Coleman was killed when the explosion reached the Richmond yards. He stayed at the quay. He had three things at once in that room. He had been told what the cargo was, he understood the geography well enough to know exactly who was in the path of it, and he had a transmission system, a telegraph network spanning Atlantic Canada, already in his hands. The warning traveled because all three conditions were present simultaneously in one person in the minutes available. Everywhere else that morning, one or two of those conditions were missing. The inquiry that followed was one of the most consequential maritime proceedings in Canadian history. It was also limited in the precise way the morning had been limited. The inquiry focused on the collision. It asked who had right-of-way in the Narrows, who had signaled first, who bore responsibility for the maneuvering sequence that ended at impact. Criminal charges were laid against Frances Mackey, the Mont-Blanc's pilot, and Aimé Lemedec, her captain, as well as against a Royal Navy commander named Wyatt. None of them were ultimately convicted. Mackey was discharged on habeas corpus, charges against Lemedec were dismissed, and Wyatt was acquitted. In civil proceedings, Mont-Blanc was initially found solely at fault. Later appeals held both vessels jointly responsible. Captain of the Emo had died in the explosion. These were real questions about real navigational failures. The Emo had been on the wrong side of the channel. The series of signals and course corrections that preceded the collision was a genuine breakdown, and understanding it mattered for how the Narrows would be managed in the future. But the inquiry spent very little time on the 19 minutes after the collision. It did not ask in any sustained way why no signal system existed to broadcast the nature of the Mont-Blanc's cargo to the other vessels in the Narrows when something went wrong. It did not ask why the schools closest to the pier received no warning. It did not ask why the Stella Maris moved toward the burning ship rather than away from it. It did not ask what the Harbor Commission should have built in advance to prevent a cargo manifest from existing in isolation from the people it was most relevant to. The inquiry was constructed to answer the question of who caused the collision. The question of why the consequences were allowed to be this large did not quite fit the framework it was set up to apply. More than 1,600 people were killed. Many accounts put the final toll near 2,000, and the confirmed dead recorded by the Nova Scotia Archives, number 182. 9,000 more were injured. 12,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. The Richmond district was leveled. It was rebuilt afterward on a different street grid because the original streets no longer corresponded to anything standing. The Mont-Blanc's anchor landed 3 kilometers to the north. Engineers surveyed the crater. The explosion reshaped a peninsula. Vince Coleman is named on the memorial in Halifax. The telegraph office where he worked is gone. The rail yards are gone. What he did survives in the record. A message sent along a network, a sequence of events set in motion, a city that had aid arriving on the same day it was destroyed because someone in a wooden building near Pier 6 understood what he had been told and had the means to pass it on. Here is what those 19 minutes show, taken all together. The Mont-Blanc's crew knew what she carried and rowed away. The men of the Stella Maris and the High Flyers boat knew how to fight a harbor fire and move toward it. The teachers at Richmond School knew their students and had no reason to move them. Coleman knew the railway network and used it. Each person acted on the information they had. The gap was not in the people. The gap was in what each person was given to act on. The cargo manifest was not secret. The danger was documented. The French Navy had signed it. The British command had a copy. The Harbor Pilot Office had processed the Mont-Blanc's entry. The warning existed from the moment the ship entered the Narrows. What had never been built was the requirement that the warning move, that the fact recorded in a document become a live signal to patrol boats, to school administrators, to the crowds on the waterfront, to everyone positioned in the path of what would happen if something went wrong. Coleman's key was already there. The network was already there. The information reached him by accident, through a door that happened to open at the right moment. Everywhere else, the warning existed but did not travel. That is the lesson of Halifax. A warning is not a fact written down somewhere. It is a fact that reaches the person who needs it before the clock runs out.